Joining me today are Thomas Borwick, who's the director of the College Green Group based in London, England, and is a conservative strategist, and Rick Perkins, Member of Parliament for South Shore, St. Margaret's. Good to have both of you on the show today. Thank you. Well, both Rick and Thomas, several things that you have in common. You're both conservatives, one Canadian, one British, but both parties are actually undergoing leadership campaigns. Boris Johnson, who resigned as Prime Minister and head of the UK Conservative Party, and in Canada, Erin O'Toole resigned as a Conservative leader, and there's an active campaign that's going to conclude in a few weeks that applies to both. So, how did we get there? Thomas, how did the Conservatives dump Boris Johnson?
I suppose it was death by 1,000 cuts. There were a series of small issues over the last few years. There's been some inconsistencies over the COVID legislation and process. Boris Johnson believes in redemption. Boris Johnson very much believed in promoting those people that may have done wrong in the past but had the opportunity for forgiveness and working with them. Some of those people have let themselves down and the party down. There's a variety of different reasons there was discontent between the seats facing the Liberal Democrats in the South and those facing Labour in the North. It was clear that a populist Prime Minister was always going to have a problem after COVID, and people wanted to work out financially both how we pay, but how the dividends and prosperity could be divided. Levelling up has been a great agenda item for the Conservative Party, but it hasn't had the output as fast and as quickly as people wanted. That impatience and that concern that Boris Johnson was not going to win the next general election has meant that he's been replaced and a leadership election has been triggered. As part of that process, there was a vote of no confidence. That vote of no confidence was actually won by Boris Johnson, but further conversations occurred, and unfortunately, as a result of those, he then resigned. This is not a universally popular opinion, and about 40% of party members say on recent polls that they'd be happy to have him back as Prime Minister.
Well, he did deliver one of the largest Conservative victories in the last election in the UK.
Absolutely. He has been a fantastic electoral asset. But one of the most astonishing things about the Conservative Party is their ability to do regicide. The number of leaders that we have got rid of is astonishing, but that has given a longevity to the Conservative Party. After all, it's been 11 years in government in the same broad stripes of Conservatives. Particularly if you go back in time, we have many very successful and perhaps unsuccessful Prime Ministers or leaders of the Conservative Party that have been got rid of by the 1922 committee.
And contrast that in Canada, Rick, with what Thomas just shared with us. The Conservatives have been out of power for a number of years now. They've had 3 new leaders in 3 elections, all of which they've lost. And now they're going to elect a new leader. How does this square with how Conservatives feel?
Yeah, well, it's a good summary of our situation, Marcel. Of course, one of those 3 leaders was former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who was nearing the end of his 10-year term when he faced re-election, an attempt to another re-election in 2015, and it's very difficult for a lot of governments, at least in our country, to survive past 10 years. The party ran a pretty poor campaign in 2015, and Justin Trudeau, with his sunny ways and woke politics, ruled the day. You know, basically people were tired of Stephen Harper. In 2019, where I was a candidate, an unsuccessful candidate for Parliament, we had a new leader, Andrew Scheer, who was fairly young and made a number of missteps during that campaign, from questions about his resume to his handling of social conservative issues. And there was just a lack of trust at the door with him. So while we managed to reduce Justin Trudeau's majority to a minority, the party was pretty unhappy with the fact that Andrew wasn't able to win, and didn't think he had a possibility for staying power. In that case, it was really pressure from the caucus and pressure from the party, and no formal process that led Andrew to step down. We faced another leadership, and Erin O'Toole, a caucus member, won. He faced an election in 2021, which again I ran and was successful in my riding. But we actually lost 2 seats, even though we won the popular vote. We got more votes than the Liberal Party. Liberal Party won a minority government. There was a lot of angst within the caucus and the party, and we had a power that is available to all the parties in Canada, but only the Conservative Party takes advantage of. The caucus chose to exercise its right under an act of Parliament to hold a vote of non-confidence in the leader, and Erin was not successful, did not survive that vote in January, which launched us into the leadership campaign that we're in now. There are already rumors, as you know, Marcel, of an election perhaps as early as this fall. I doubt we'll see that, but with Liberals, if the polls look good for them, they'll pull the plug if that's to their advantage. So our leadership is over on September 10th, so our process is a little different than the British process. We have a one-member, one-vote system, which I personally don't like, where a $15 membership allows you to vote in the leadership. We have a record membership of any political party in Canada. We've risen we had about 275,000 members in the last leadership 2 years ago. We now have almost 700,000 members of the party, which speaks to the main 2 challengers and their popularity, but it also speaks to, I think, a real shift in the public and disappointment and anger with the current government. Many people around the world saw the trucker convoy here in Canada in February, a very large populist movement that developed as a result of frustration with government policy over COVID. And that's also contributed to where we are today.
So let me ask Thomas, how do the UK Conservatives elect their leader? We just heard from Rick saying that it's a one member, one vote system. They have a slightly different way of doing it. And Rick, I'm going to try and concisely explain, is that each riding is given 100 points, and depending on the number of votes cast for a candidate, they get a percentage of that 100 points. And then the number of points overall across the country, that's more than 50% plus one, becomes the next leader. So Thomas, how does the UK Conservatives elect their leader?
We seem to have a fantastically exciting process in Canada, and congratulations to those that make such a process work. So we have a very simple process. The Conservative Party had elections, give or take, every Tuesday and Thursday within the members of Parliament. Their responsibility is to get the list down to 2 people. Those 2 people are then given to the wider Conservative Party electorate, about 175,000 members, give or take. That process is, for this year, for the first time, being done on an online ballot. It's clear that GCHQ and other entities have raised concerns about this ballot, but we are hopeful, for the sake of the Conservative Party, that it is a sensible ballot. The end of voting is September the 3rd, with September the 5th being the date that the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will be announced. At the moment, most of the polls are favouring Liz Truss, but it's entirely possible that Rishi Sunak wins at this stage.
So really quite a different method between Canada and the UK. Let's talk a little bit about the candidates and the seemingly shift to the right, at least in Canada. The last two leaders, Scheer and O'Toole, both projected themselves as more on the right-wing side. The leading contender for the Conservatives in this campaign is Pierre Poilievre, who's a more populist, further to the right candidate. In the UK, we have Johnson, who portrayed himself as a bit of a populist. And then now we have the Truss and Sunak are the two candidates. I'd like to get both of your opinions on where you think things are shaping out.
Well, in terms of Canada, I just say I really like the British system. I actually had many conversations with former leader William Hague back when he was leader of the British Tory Party, and they reformed the constitution to that method. I think it gives members of parliament a significant role. This is the first time in modern Canadian history where the caucus, in our case, the caucus actually had a confidence vote in the leader. Generally, it's party and convention. So,
and it should be pointed out, Rick, that came under Stephen Harper's administration.
Yeah, it was a result of the merger of the two Conservative parties that had split from the Mulroney days into two parties. When they came back together, that method of electing was part of the negotiation between the two parties. So in terms of the candidates, we had 6, we've got 5 that are going to the membership. The two front runners are former Premier of Quebec, Jean Charest, who is also a former leader of our party from one of our predecessor parties in the 1990s. He was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, and he was a minister under the Brian Mulroney days as well, and Deputy Prime Minister at one point. And Pierre Poilievre, who is been in Parliament for 17 years, is in his early 40s. You're right, Marcel. Many call Pierre a populist. Pierre is a bit more of a libertarian, I think, than he is a populist. He believes, obviously, that there isn't much that government does, that it does well. And so less government is usually a better. Jean Charest is more of a progressive conservative in the style of very progressive on social issues, but a fiscal conservative. So we have two contrasting styles. They're both very effective public speakers and politicians. Pierre has tapped into the angst of COVID that you saw in the Freedom Convoy. In fact, freedom and making Canada the freest country in the world is basically the slogan of his leadership campaign. And he is the odds-on favorite. We really don't know, because at the end of the day, it depends how many of the 675,000 people actually mail in their ballots. And as you said, Marcel, in what proportion and what riding do they mail them in? Jean Charest is very strong in Quebec and Atlantic Canada and doing well in the urban areas. And Pierre Poilievre is dominant in the prairies in Western Canada and doing well in Ontario too. And to be fair, outside of Quebec, Pierre has support in pretty much every other riding.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, can you give us a quick rundown of the two candidates for the UK Conservative leadership?
Yeah, so both are trying to position themselves as not incumbents, whereas looking at their past history, it's both clear that they've been presiding over the current problems and current crisis. It's hard to argue that Boris Johnson was particularly right-leaning, given the huge amount of state intervention we had in the COVID period. We have Rishi Sunak arguing for tax increases, the planned national insurance, and the projections with company corporate taxes. We have Liz Truss saying that actually the way to beat inflation is lower taxes. Now, neither are going to roll back the state. Both have tried to argue for reviews of the EU legislation agenda. looking at the plan to export illegal immigrants to Rwanda. Both are in favour of that, but both are also committing to net zero on the current stated objectives. So we're not seeing a lurch for the right or left. It's probably quite a similar agenda to what we've had with the more recent Conservative Party, and that might give cause for concern by many of the right wing of the Conservative Party that we have seen an irrevocable shift to the middle. Whether or not that is electorally good or bad is certainly to be considered, and something we probably won't know till May 2024, the likely next date of the general election.
Well, both leadership races will conclude in early September. September 5th, if I'm correct, Thomas, for the UK, and September 10th for the Canadian Conservatives. And so I'd like to invite both of you back to discuss who the winner is and what that means for each of your respective parties. I want to thank Rick Perkins, the Member of Parliament for South Shore St. Margaret, and Thomas Borwick, who's the Director of College Green Group, for joining me today. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Marcel.
Marcel.
Look forward to coming back after September 10th.